Rosemary West. And this is a pretty dark story, so just know that going in. In the fall of 1992, a detective in southwest England was assigned to work a rape case involving a teenage girl. This detective was a seasoned detective. She really thought she had seen it all, and she kind of did. She saw a lot of crime in her day-to-day work as a detective, but it always affected her. She still got brokenhearted, especially when these crimes involved children. The teenage girl was just 13 years old at the time that she had been sexually assaulted, and she told police exactly who had raped her. It was her father, Fred West, and according to the girl, he had sexually assaulted her multiple times in the past. She went on to tell the detective he had not acted alone. In fact, her mother, Rosemary West, had been in the room while her father sexually assaulted her, and her mother was even encouraging her father. So this detective is horrified by what this young victim is telling her, and she immediately looks into the West family. It isn't long before investigators learn that Rosemary West is using her family home as a base for sex work, which is something her husband is encouraging. And there are 5 children living at the home, and they all know about the things happening behind closed doors, or sometimes not closed doors at all. This detective finds that this is not the first time that law enforcement has looked into Fred and Rosemary West. Back in the 70s, they had both been convicted for indecent assault against another young woman. So police officers know there's something bad going on here. Between the previous conviction and the current risk to the West kids' safety, this was enough probable cause for them to get a search warrant to search the West house at 25 Cromwell Street. They wanted to look for any type of evidence that there was child sexual abuse going on in the home. So they go in and they look through the home. They find sex toys, a collection of porn magazines, whips, restraints, bondage gear, and almost 100 pornographic videos, some of them homemade. Investigators gather all of this sex paraphernalia and they take it in as evidence because, while it's not illegal to have these things, this pornography was out, like, for the kids to see. They arrest Fred and Rosemary West and take their 5 children into protective custody. Now, they have these allegations of incest and rape, plus a plethora of sex gear. And knowing the couple's criminal history, police know they need to dig deep to figure out exactly what has been going on inside this home. Now let's talk about the children who lived in the home at the time. There were 5 kids living in the home at the time of the arrest, but there were other kids. They had a daughter named Heather who had run away in She talks about being raised in a home where rape, incest from both parents happened all the time. Abuse and torture were everyday occurrences. She was regularly raped by both of her parents starting at the age of 8. She was eventually forced into sex work before she was even a teenager. She ran away from home at 15 years old after being impregnated by her father, which I guess this was like a tubal pregnancy and it had been terminated. So that was her story to police. The other West kids spoke to police and told them similar horror stories about growing up with Fred and Rosemary West as parents. These kids had all been terrified to come forward and tell anyone about the abuse because their father would threaten them, and he would say, "If you ever tell anyone about this, you will end up under the patio." Investigators don't fully understand at the time the meaning of this threat, but they continue to try to track down the older West kids, the ones that have already left home. So they track down Anne-Marie, and they track down Stephen, but no one can track down Heather. It's like she's just vanished without a trace. When police question Rosemary about her firstborn child, she says she has no idea where Heather has gone. And after several interviews with police, she kind of begins to change her story a little bit. And she claims that Heather ran away to Wales to live with her lesbian lover. Now, the Wests had never reported her missing or as a runaway, but the more police look into Heather's disappearance, the more they realize that no one has seen Heather for like 5 years. Not since 1987 when she supposedly ran away. So basically, through the rest of 1992, police are trying to track down Heather. By 1993, Rosemary and Fred are getting ready to go to court to face charges. But the case begins to kind of unravel after the 13-year-old West daughter, the one who kind of started the ball rolling in this case, just cannot handle the anxiety of testifying in court against her parents. The case really hinged on the West children's testimony, and even Anna Marie ends up deciding not to testify against her parents. Now, yes, they have evidence, but it wasn't really illegal to own any of the things found in the house, so police are kind of watching their case just crumble. Now, there were some rumors that some of these pornographic tapes that were seized at the West House included footage of Fred and Rosemary raping their own children. But we'll never really know because police destroyed all of these tapes as soon as they brought them into evidence without ever watching to see what was on them. So without the testimony of the daughter, they have nothing against these parents. also can't track down Heather, and they've been told some very concerning things about her from the social workers who were monitoring the West children while they were in state custody. Basically, whenever Heather's name got brought up, the West children would say, "She's under the patio." That is when it clicks for police. These kids have been terrified to come forward and talk about their abuse because their father kept saying he would put them under the patio. And now they're talking about their older sister, who's been missing for years, being under the patio. Police realize at this point it is completely unlikely that Heather ever ran away, and they think she was killed and buried under the patio. A patio that had been installed in the home in 1987, the year Heather supposedly ran away. So investigators go to work trying to compile enough evidence to get a warrant to begin searching the home, digging up the yard. It took about 6 months, but in 1994, police were able to get a warrant to dig on the West property so they could look for Heather's body. So they started digging on February 24th, 1994, and the next day, before police had ever found anything, Fred admits the truth. He tells them that he killed Heather and that she's buried in the garden. He tells them he was the one who killed her. So they arrest him right away, and 2 days later, police find Heather's dismembered remains buried on the West property. The remains were taken to the medical examiner so he could do an autopsy, and that's when the medical examiner noticed something. Now Heather's remains had been dismembered, so he was essentially brought a pile of bones, and as he's sifting through the bones, he realizes there's an extra femur bone in the pile of Heather's remains, a femur bone that does not belong to Heather, which means someone else is buried near her. And suddenly this investigation goes from like this big to just blowing up. They know that they have got to dig deep into Fred and Rosemary's backgrounds to try and figure out how they got to this point. What else could have been going on in this house, and why there were bodies buried in their backyard. What they find out kind of makes sense, but it also makes them sick to their stomachs. Fred West was born September 29th, 1941 in England. He was the second of 6 children, and according to Fred, his childhood was pretty horrific. There were various kinds of sexual abuse going on inside his home. His father regularly abused his sisters, and even, according to Fred, taught his young son how to engage in bestiality. It was also suspected that Fred's mother began sexually abusing him as well around the time he turned 12, although he never admitted to this. But you will see as we get deeper into the story, he felt that incest was kind of a normal school and scream at the teachers for punishing her favorite child. By the time he was 15 years old, he had dropped out of school. Even though he had attended school for years and years, he was basically completely illiterate. So once he dropped out of school, he had no choice but to go work on a farm. Around the time he turned 16, he kind of started to care a little bit more about what he looked like. When he was 17, he was involved in a motorcycle wreck and ended up in a coma for a week. While he did recover, he had a metal plate surgically placed in his skull, and he had broken his leg so badly that it healed slightly shorter than his other leg. After this accident, he had this shift in his personality, and he began losing his temper very easily and having violent outbursts. 2 years after this accident, he had another serious head injury. He put his hand up a girl's skirt and she pushed him off the fire escape that they were standing on. Many experts believe that these head injuries would have left some serious brain damage, which could have made him prone to fits of rage and could have possibly negatively impacted his impulse control. There are studies that link head injuries and repeated violent criminal behavior. One study found that 12 out of 16 people who are currently on death row have a history of traumatic brain injuries. In most cases, there is a history of several head injuries, not just one. The link between brain injuries and violent crimes is thought to be linked to the frontal lobe. So when the frontal lobe is injured, this is associated with a loss of impulse control, which in turn kind of makes people more violent. When Fred was 19, he was convicted of molesting a 13-year-old girl, but he never served time for this because his doctor came forward and said that Fred suffered from epileptic fits, and this was enough to get him out of any trouble. It was around this point that his family disowned him. Now, Rosemary also came from a horrible family situation. Rosemary Letts was born on February 25th, 1961. She was the fifth of 7 children born into an extremely poor family. Rosemary's mother suffered from depression, and when she was pregnant with Rosemary, she received electroconvulsive therapy, and a lot of people would later argue that this treatment may have caused some prenatal injuries to her daughter. Rose herself grew up into a moody and precarious teenager prone to daydreaming, and she also did very poorly in school. Her parents separated when she was a teenager, and she lived with her mother for a while, and then when she was 16, she moved in with her father. Her father suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was prone to extreme violence and repeatedly sexually abused Rosemary and her older sister. As Rosemary began going through puberty, she kind of became fascinated by her changing body, and she would walk around the house completely naked in the presence of her younger brother and father. she began spending time with him in his home that he shared with his 2 children from another marriage, his daughter Anna Marie and his stepdaughter Charmaine. She began taking care of these girls, and soon she was their primary caregiver. Fred would give her money for taking care of the girls, and she would in turn tell her parents that she made this money working at a bread shop. Eventually, Rosemary's parents found out that she was dating Fred and called social services to report that their 15-year-old daughter was in a sexual relationship with a much older man. They had also heard rumors that their daughter was making money by kind of dabbling in sex work, and this was at her boyfriend's encouragement. Rosemary was placed in a home for troubled children, and she was only allowed to leave to go visit her parents' house on weekends, which of course she would sneak away to see Fred. On her 16th birthday, Rosemary left the home of her troubled teens to go visit her parents. Fred was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines, and as soon as he was released, Rosemary ran away with Fred. Fred and her picked up, they took his girls, who had been in the custody of social services while Fred was in jail. So he gets out, Rosemary runs to him, they pick up the 2 girls, and they take off. In 1970, Rosemary gave birth to the couple's first child together, a little girl who they named Heather Ann. When Fred was arrested, just after this, he served 6 months for car theft. Fred basically couldn't get a job. He had no skills, so he was just breaking the law, trying to make money. When he was released, Rosemary had just turned 17 years old, and she was the primary caregiver to 3 young children. This was when the abuse really escalated. Fred had always been pretty abusive, but Rosemary began taking it to a whole new level. Anne-Marie would later say they were all physically and emotionally abused. Anne-Marie would often just submit to the abuse, and she cried while being abused, but Charmaine, her older sister, refused to give Rose the satisfaction of seeing her cry. This infuriated Rosemary. Shortly before Fred was released from prison in June of 1971, Rosemary killed Charmaine. At some point, while he was still incarcerated, one of Charmaine's friends came to visit her, and Rosemary told the friend, Charmaine has gone to live with her mother, Rena. Rena still saw her children semi-regularly, so soon she began asking questions when she hadn't seen or heard from Charmaine. But just as quickly as Rena started raising questions, she stopped. This was when the couple moved out of their old house and into their home on Cromwell Street. So, you can kind of see how Fred and Rosemary came from these horrible, toxic backgrounds, and for whatever reason, they really brought out the worst in each other. Their son Stephen would later say that the 2 of them together decide to rent it out to young women who they are sexually attracted to. Rosemary was bisexual, and she was just as big of a sexual predator as Fred. So that indecent exposure that police had uncovered had stemmed from this 1972 incident where they hired this 17-year-old girl named Caroline to come be their live-in nanny. And they started making sexual advances towards her, and she did not like that, so she quit. And this really pissed them off, so they end up kidnapping her, and they beat her, and they rape her, and during this assault, they're threatening to kill her and hide her body where it will never be found. Caroline escapes the next morning and goes to police, but she could not handle the stress of testifying in court against these people and reliving the whole thing. So basically, Fred and Rosemary, their rape charges get dropped, and they kind of just get a fine and a slap on the wrist. So it seems like this whole ordeal is what makes them realize, okay, if we do this and our victims go to the police, we get arrested. So we need to make sure our victims can't go to the police. In 1973, a 19-year-old girl named Linda rented the extra bedroom in Fred and Rosemary's home. She didn't mind how openly sexual the couple were, kind of made her feel like a grown-up, and she was even open to having sex with Fred and Rosemary, who was pregnant at this point. Linda's mom hadn't seen her daughter since she moved into the West's home, and she wanted to go see where she was living and check in. So she goes to the home. Rosemary opens the door, and she's wearing Linda's shoes. And she tells Linda's mother she hasn't seen her, she never lived there, she doesn't know what she's talking about. But Linda's mother is like, you're lying, you're wearing my daughter's shoes. So Rosemary's like, well, actually, she did live here. We hired her as our nanny, but she hit one of our kids, so we fired her and made her move out. Linda's mother can't get any more information from Rosemary, so she leaves, completely unaware of her daughter's cruel fate. Linda's mother, for whatever reason, never filed an official missing persons report. I think the family did try to find Linda, but she was never officially reported missing. There was never an official search conducted, and Linda just kind of disappeared. The lack of search for her and the lack of law enforcement being told meant that no one went to the West's house to inquire about Linda, and the Wests kind of got away with this, so they became more bold in their actions. They started to her young daughter as her secretary to keep track of her appointments with all of her different clients. I really cannot fathom how this went on for so long without anyone noticing what was going on in this home. One of the West's later victims was an 18-year-old girl named Shirley Robinson, and she goes missing while she's pregnant with Fred's baby. Shirley was a runaway. She had no family. She was the perfect type of girl for the Wests to prey on. So she's pregnant, she's receiving prenatal care, and all of a sudden she just stops showing up to her doctor's appointments. This was pretty late in her pregnancy when she just stopped showing up. There was no record of the baby ever being born, but no one raised concern. Remember, she had no family involved in her life, so no one realizes she's missing. Somehow, she just slips through the cracks. No one was even looking for her. There were several other victims who were reported missing, and police did look for them, but the Wests never came up on anyone's radar. By 1987, Rosemary and Fred had 8 children. Some of them were biologically theirs, and some of them had been fathered by Rosemary's clients. Between the mid-70s and late 80s, various West children were taken to the emergency room for a total of 31 times to be treated for injuries. So it seemed like no one really understood how bad it was for these kids until Heather's bones were being dug up from the backyard. And now that police have Heather's remains, they know that their hunch about Fred and Rosemary was correct. In addition to Heather's dismembered remains and this extra femur bone, the investigators began finding body after body after body, each one telling their own horror story. And while this is happening, police realize someone else is missing from this family, Charmaine West. Law enforcement decides they need to expand their digging of the West property. They want to begin digging in the cellar. So on March 4th, 1994, officers tell Fred they're going to be searching inside of the home and digging in the cellar. And a few hours later, police are given a note from Fred's lawyer. And this is what the note says. I, Frederick West, authorize my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to further approximately 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Lindigo, and others to be identified. And this letter was signed F. West. Fred is adamant that he did all of these killings and that Rosemary had nothing to do with the murders. But Anna Marie knows this can't be true. She knows her stepmother. Police start tracking down and interviewing all of the tenants who had rented out that room in the West's home over the years. And they learn that the tenants all reported hearing strange noises late at night, and they would talk about the house having charges are stacking up. Fred West seems to have a mental break. At the end of March 1994, Fred tells police where Rena is, and he ends up taking them to where he left her body. On April 11th, police uncover her remains exactly where Fred said they would be. Charmaine's remains were located just a few weeks later, and she had been buried under the kitchen in the West's old home. She had been just 8 years old when she was murdered. These are not the last victims to be found, though. Fred also tells police that a former mistress of his is buried, and police go and uncover the dismembered remains of 18-year-old Anna McFall, who was pregnant with Fred's child when she vanished in 1967. She was one of the victims who had never even been reported missing. Anna McFall is the final known victim of the Wests to be found by police, and this brought the total to 12, although police do believe there could have been as many as 30 victims. Fred West was charged with all 12 counts of murder, and Rosemary was charged with 10. Before his case went to trial, Fred committed suicide. On January 1st, 1995, they found Fred hanging from his jail cell. Rosemary's trial started in October of 1995, and she tried to deny any knowledge of anything. She tried to put all of the blame on Fred. She said she had been in an abusive situation, but she was not responsible. However, the prosecution called in witness after witness after witness who painted a much different story of Rosemary West, and it showed that she was just as much a predator as her husband. The jury sees right through Rosemary's claims of innocence, and in the end, she is found guilty on 10 counts of murder, and she was sentenced to prison without the possibility of parole. She is 66 years old and will likely, hopefully, die